Hi there, my name is Shannon and I'm Willamette Week's music and visual arts editor. I'm here today with John Goodell, who is a conservation biologist and who is also the outreach director for the Alaka Alliance, which is a nonprofit that is dedicated to reintroducing sea otters to Oregon. John, how you doing today?
Good, how are you?
Hanging in there. So to start off, sea otters are obviously very, very cute, but they're also an important part of the ecosystem. So how has the Oregon coast been affected by the current lack of sea otters?
Yeah, one way to think about this is the various impacts that, say, Euro-American settlers have had on the Pacific West. Really, in many cases, was not that long ago. I mean, a lot of the impacts were only sort of in really the 20th century, because some of the earlier homestead sites in Oregon were not much later than, say, the late 1800s. So the context there, the importance of that is that the sea otter fur trade was almost a full century before, or over a century before that. So in the 1780s, 1790s, Russian fur traders, hunters, and British and some American were starting to become very active across the range of the sea otter, and they were hunting them actively for furs. And at the time, sea otter furs were the most valuable fur in the world, and that fur trade went on for quite a number of decades. But we think that the sea otter population was functionally lost. I mean, there were still some individuals here and there, but functionally lost by the mid to late 1800s in Oregon. So very early loss. And so it's hard to say what the kelp habitat looked like before the sea otters were lost, but what we think was that when sea otters were abundant in the Oregon coast, there was much more kelp habitat. And as a result, the species associated with kelp, which are many fish species, rockfish, it's a nursery habitat for juvenile fish like salmon and rockfish and others, those populations of fish would have been much more abundant. So it's hard to say exactly, but what we know from other places where we have seen otters both present and absent is that there's just more kelp and more biodiversity and abundance associated with kelp.
So more sea otters means more kelp. Why is that?
Yeah, so what happens with kelp in the Pacific is that without sea otters and without another predator called the sunflower sea star, which we can talk about, there's populations of herbivores, kelp herbivores, that can sort of go unchecked to some degree, like the purple and red sea urchins. There's also in other parts of the Pacific a few other species like the green sea urchin. And they eat kelp. And sometimes when there's a lot of kelp around, they are fairly stationary. And as kelp breaks apart in the water column and drifts, they capture that drifting kelp pieces and consume that. But they can become very abundant without any predator above them. And if they get to a certain density, they start eating a lot more kelp, and they start actually consuming the standing kelp. And so sea urchins in particular, they can get to a state called an urchin barren, which is basically they've consumed almost all the kelp. There's extremely high density of sea urchins, and they can live in that state dormant for decades. And so that can become what they call a stable state. Without sea otters or without the sunflower sea star, another urchin predator, they can really persist in this stable state of no kelp. Whereas in other populations of prey, if they get too abundant and too dense, disease and starvation will actually cause them to collapse. Well, it's not the case with urchins, and that's what's a unique factor of their natural history, which allows them to persist in this state and actually prevents kelp from recovering, if that makes sense.
For sure. So there have been successful attempts at reintroducing sea otters in other parts of the country. Why hasn't it worked here in Oregon yet?
Yeah, and I think if you can imagine, and the listener knows anything about Southeast Alaska or British Columbia and the coastline, a lot of that coastline is a series of meandering inlets and coves and islands. It's a lot of it is very protected, and there's a lot of shallow or shallower protected waters in the form of these small coves and islands. And as a result, there's just exponentially more sea otter habitat. There's also more protection from the weather, And so if you were to drive a boat into one of those inlets and release some otters, you have a pretty high chance of being successful. In Oregon, the introduction there was actually met with some very bad winter storms during the attempt to move them to a particular location. And some of the otters were lost overboard, some were let go prematurely. Another example where some of them were towed in the open ocean to try to get them to a site. And so there were some issues that I think are really particular to the Oregon example that were logistical, snafus, some challenges, and the fact that Oregon's sea otter habitat is really these small, relatively, isolated places that are really punctuated by pretty big exposed stretches of coastline, beaches, sandy beaches that have a lot of exposure to winter storms. And so for that reason, I think you almost have to, it's almost like you have to take extra precaution to release them very carefully in those little oases that exist on the Oregon South Coast. And in the case of this reintroduction, it just didn't go very well. And I think so, to answer your question with a shorter answer, it was this particular release just had some challenges that those other release sites didn't.
Right. So earlier this year, Alaka Alliance got funding to do a feasibility study on bringing back sea otters to Oregon. Where are you now with that study?
Yeah, so they started that feasibility study just this fall, and it's just fairly in its early stages. So I would be looking for a result from that in next year. Probably in the winter, spring of next year, they'll start to be wrapping that up. But there's several key experts in the world of sea otters that are actually the leading experts. You've probably heard of Jim Estes, Tim Tinker, Sean Larson with the Seattle Aquarium, and some others that are going to be leading this effort. So we're really thrilled that the feasibility study is actually, instead of just being one investigator, it's going to be basically almost all of the experts on sea otters in the Pacific Coast.
What are some of the main factors that they're going to be looking at during this study?
Yeah, I think they're going to be assessing the sites that might be suitable. They're going to look at what sort of population may be viable in Oregon. Again, what sites that might have the highest potential in terms of prey and refuge from storms, things like that. Looking at what source populations would be ideal for the reintroduced potential translocation. So looking at genetics and other factors like that, and the logistics of pulling it off in terms of capture and relocation and permitting. And then there's going to be a second part of that study, which is sort of an attachment to it, which is the economic impact assessment. And that's a critical piece because sea otters do have an effect on shellfish harvest rates, basically. And we know this from other parts of their range. And so there's going to be a third party, experts are going to be hired to conduct that economic impact assessment to make sure or to identify the pros and cons of sea otter presence with respect to different industries. And so there could be some pros, like to the finfish, the fishing community, commercial and recreation fishing community, because more kelp usually means more fish. But there could be some cons to, say, the harvest of urchins or other shellfish like crabs. But there could be some pros to the tourism industry and so coastal communities. So there's a lot to consider, and they're going to try to take that on.
Best case scenario, what's the earliest that Oregon could possibly see sea otters reintroduced to the coast?
It's fairly early to be sort of talking about it. It's really, I think the most important thing is to sort of be discussing the feasibility questions, discussing the economic questions, to be talking to the various people that will be affected in the ocean user group, the ocean stakeholder groups, and to try to get their comments and their feedback and to try to listen to their perspectives. And of course, this also includes the tribal communities. The Alaka Alliance was founded by David Hatch, the late David Hatch, who was a leader of the Siletz tribe. And so it's important to really hear from the full suite of perspectives, I think, now, and then we can start assigning dates later.